like to welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you all. I think this should be a great program. We've opened this up to everybody, so we hope that everybody will enjoy it. Before we get started, I'd like to say that if you would like to become a sponsor for any of these programs, the cost is $250, but it can be split among one, two, as many people that would like to sponsor a program. It helps us to get really interesting programs for sisterhood. And just call Linda or myself or Ellie or anybody on the program committee. We'd like to get you to sponsor programs so that we can get really interesting programs.
Well, this program, Patty, was sponsored by Sally.
That was my next thing, Ellie. You took it out of my mouth. Thank you. We want to thank Sally Crone for sponsoring tonight. Sally had heard Tom, and she came back with a glowing report of this wonderful program. And Sally is sponsoring this in honor of Tom and this wonderful program because she knows how wonderful it is. So thank you, Sally. I also want to remind you that Sisterhood Shabbat is coming up. It's March 25th. If you would like a part in English or Hebrew, please see Kathy Banker. She's looking for more people. And Kathy would be happy to share with you the parts that are available. So please talk to Sally because she is looking for more people.
Kathy.
Kathy Banker. Anyway, before we start, I'm going to ask you please to mute yourself because the program will be much more interesting without hearing your radio and TV. So please mute yourself. During the program, think about questions, but we're going to not ask for questions until the end of the program. At the end of the program, Tom will be very happy to take your questions. Okay. I'm going to turn this over now to Linda, who's going to introduce our speaker. Linda?
Thank you. So all of you who started out on the screen earlier have been talking about all the things that you remember about Philadelphia. And according to Tom, Philadelphia was not only the birthplace of America, but also the birthplace of America's consumer culture. So we remember things like Gimbels and Strawbridge and Clothier and John Wanamaker and Lit Brothers. And we remember impressive jewelry stores like Caldwell's and Bailey Banks and Biddle, and stores that sold high-end clothing like Nanduskin and the Blum store, just to name a few. And so Tom and Lawrence Argale wrote a book called Philadelphia's Golden Age of Retail. And they talk about all of these things and more. Just to give you a little background, Tom is a lecturer, a writer, commentator specializing in Philadelphia history and architecture. He has spoken to many of Philadelphia's leading cultural and historical organizations. He appeared in numerous documentaries, including Philadelphia, The Great Experiment, Philly Firsts on WLVT TV, Buried Stones, Buried Dreams, a feature on Mount Moriah Cemetery for the Precious Places Project. He is also a contributing writer for the Rittenhouse Square Review, and he's also written articles for the Chestnut Hill Local, the Mainline Times, the Springfield Sun, Philadelphia Style Magazine, the Germantown Crier, and the Journal of Historical Society of Montgomery County. In addition to that, Tom is a tour guide at the Laurel Hill Cemetery, and he conducts classes in Philadelphia's cemetery history in Bucks County at the Community College, at Cheltenham Township Adult School, and the Mount Airy Learning Tree. So Tom, we are welcoming you. We're happy to have you, and we're waiting to hear about all those things that we remember from when we were younger and got to see them.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to go over to screen share and start my slideshow. And if somebody could just give me a heads up and let me know that it's appearing as such on your screens. Good. Okay, then we are ready to go. Thank you very much, Linda, for that nice introduction. As Linda told you, I'm here to talk to you tonight about Philadelphia's Golden Age of Retail, which is a book that recalls a time when Philadelphia was truly a mercantile mecca, its central shopping district lined with cathedrals of commerce. And tonight, I'd like to specialize on a subject I call That's Retailtainment, which will show you how the retailers that once lined Market and Chestnut Street used every trick of the trade to attract shoppers. And as you can see from this December 1936 photograph of Chestnut Street that shows Caldwell's and Wanamaker's on the right and the Blum store on the left, they did a very good job. Now, the innovators who founded Philadelphia's great department stores, and tonight I am going to specialize on the department stores because if I include the boutiques like Caldwell's, etc., we'll be here till midnight, so I need to limit it somehow. But the innovators like John Wanamaker, Justice Strawbridge and Isaac Clothier, Ellis Gimbel, not to mention the Litt brothers and Nathan Snellenberg, pioneered the concept of retailtainment. That is, taking shopping and turning it into an exciting and very involving act of entertainment. And they did this long before this term became a marketing buzzword in the late 1990s. Well, by the early 1900s, Philadelphia retailers really did have to utilize every trick in their marketing arsenals to attract customers. First of all, Philadelphia was still the third largest city in America. With a population of 1.3 million, it was just behind New York and Chicago. And as the workshop of the world, its hundreds of factories afforded many Philadelphians a comfortable middle-class existence with, a good amount of expendable income. Philadelphia was also the city of homes, where even a working man could rent or buy a modest house. So that was a lot of space to fit out and furnish. Every day, over 500,000 people were transported into Center City by a network of trains, trolleys, subways, ferries, and even a few automobiles. With so many people and so much expendable income, Center City, Philadelphia, especially Market East, was a shopper's paradise. The stretch of Market Street between City Hall and 7th Street was nearly wall-to-wall department stores, dominated by the Big Five: Wanamaker's at 13th Street, Snellenberg's at 11th, and then Strawbridge and Clothier, Gimbel's, and Litt Brothers, all duking it out at the intersection of 8th and Market. Over the years, the Big Five were joined by other shorter-lived stores like Blauner's, Stern Brothers, and Frank and Cedar. Meanwhile, Chestnut Street, which had been known as the Ladies' Mile since the 1820s, remained home to the specialty stores favored by the carriage trade. For jewelry, silver, and objet d'art, there was J.E. Caldwell's at 902 Chestnut and Bailey Banks Biddle at 12th and Chestnut. For fine men's clothing and furnishings, there was Jacob Reed Sons at 1424 Chestnut. Later in the 20th century, these stores would be joined by two establishments for ladies' haute couture, the Blum store at 1300 Chestnut and New York-based Bonwit Teller at 1700 Chestnut. Philadelphia's two oldest emporia, John Wanamaker's and Strawbridge and Clothier, were both founded in the 1860s. John Wanamaker opened Oak Hall, a men and boys clothing store, with his brother-in-law Nathan Brown in April 1861 at the southeast corner of 6th and Market Streets. In 1868, Justice Strawbridge and Isaac Clothier joined forces at the northwest corner of 8th and Market in what had been Justice's dry goods store. And as you can see at the beginning, both of these establishments were on a pretty modest scale. But that would change. In 1874, John Wanamaker decided to make the move uptown. He purchased the dilapidated Pennsylvania Railroad Depot and Freight Office at 13th and Market to convert into a new store. Now, although this was far west of his competitors, it was opposite the intersection of Market and Broad Streets, where the new public buildings, that is Philadelphia City Hall, were under construction. Within 2 years, Wanamaker's had transformed the decrepit structure into a Moorish wonderland called the Grand Depot. It opened on May 6, 1876, just a couple of weeks before the wildly successful Centennial Exposition in West Fairmount Park. This new kind of store attracted so many World's Fair visitors that it became known as the Centennial Annex. By 1887, the Grand Depot offered the largest space in the world devoted to retail selling on a single floor. A vast array of displays was shown on 129 sales counters arranged in concentric circles. Originally illuminated by skylights and large gasoliers, the Grand Depot became the first U.S. store to be lit by electric light on December 26, 1878. By 1893, Wanamaker's had expanded to this polyglot collection of buildings that covered the entire block, bordered by Market, Chestnut, Juniper, and 13th Streets. Meanwhile, City Hall, which had begun construction 3 years before Wanamaker's was begun, was still under construction. You can see that William Penn isn't on top of the tower yet. Beginning in 1902, Wanamaker's hodgepodge of buildings was systematically replaced by a gigantic unified structure designed by Chicago architect Daniel H. Burnham, the Wizard of the White City. The store was built in sections, beginning at Market and Juniper and moving south and east. As each new section was finished, merchandise was moved from the older section into the new one, so that not one day's worth of sales was lost. The new store was completed in 1911, the 50th anniversary of the founding of Wanamaker and Brown's Oak Hall. Its official dedication occurred on December 30th, 1911, when President William H. Taft delivered an address in the building's 6-story Grand Court to a crowd of over 30,000 spectators. In his address, President Taft referred to the department store as, quote, one of the most important instrumentalities in modern life for the promotion of comfort among people. The Wanamaker building set a standard for elegance and style unmatched by nearly any other store. The entire building became a giant stage decorated with antiques and fine art and clothed in the finest French fashions. In this opulent setting, the dreams of prosperous Philadelphia could be played out in grand style. This October 1910 photograph shows a fashion show in Egyptian Hall, one of the building's 2 auditoriums. Over 20 models are shown before a packed audience in a selection of the latest Parisian gowns, wraps, and costumes. After a fashion show like that, Wanamaker's customers needed a place where they could dine in style. For that, they had the Great Crystal Tea Room, a 22,000 square foot restaurant that could serve up to 1,400 diners at one time. In 1909, John Wanamaker purchased the world's largest pipe organ designed for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. It took 11 freight cars to ship the dismantled organ to Philadelphia by rail and another 2 years to reassemble it in the new store. It was first played on June 22, 1911, at the exact moment when King George V was being crowned King of England. The great organ was enlarged several times at the order of John Wanamaker and his son Rodman, until by 1930 it had over 28,000 pipes. Both John and Rodman also sponsored a number of special concerts featuring the organ, many with the Philadelphia Orchestra, conducted by Leopold Stokowski, whom you can see in the far distance there. And in the center foreground, you can see the store's other big acquisition from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the giant bronze eagle where Philadelphians have met for over a century. It's still in the store's main court. After Wanamaker's came Strawbridge and Clothier, still upscale, but with a slightly simpler nature, reflecting its founders' Quaker beliefs. Its customers were always referred to as friends. But Strawbridge and Clothier could rise to heights of elegance, especially during its semi-annual spring and autumn festivals, or its Fête de Printemps et d'Automne. The postcard at left promotes luxury imported French goods for a 1910 Fête Internationale, while the postcard at right shows the store's central atrium decorated for the 1912 Autumn Festival. Strawbridge and Clothier was also known for its outstanding employee chorus and orchestra. In 1905, both groups performed before a crowd of 20,000 spectators at Willow Grove Amusement Park. In its review, the Philadelphia Press wrote that the chorus represented the new mission of the 20th century store of blending beauty with business and art with merchandise. In other words, that's retailtainment. In 1906, Strawbridge and Clothier introduced its Clover Days, special sales days where discounted goods were marked by a four-leaf clover. These popular sales would remain a fixture until the store closed and lent their name to a chain of discount outlets. Clover Days illustrate how one department store could combine worldly elegance with simple value and truly be all things to all people. Gimbel Brothers was a Midwestern transplant, moving east to 9th and Market in 1894. But Gimbel's quickly became a Philadelphia institution. By 1900, it had taken over most of the block bordered by Market, Chestnut, 8th, and 9th Streets. At 23 acres, it was the largest exclusively retail store in the world. Gimbel's occupied a middle ground between upscale Wanamaker's and Strawbridge and Clothier and other more downmarket stores. At its jewelry counter, you could buy either a $4 rhinestone pendant or a $1,000 diamond solitaire ring. And Gimbel's prided itself on technical innovation. It always offered the latest thing, whether it was motor-driven delivery trucks, the first escalator in an American department store, or a testing bureau for its own merchandise. In 1893, we're getting some feedback. Is that okay, or can people hear me okay? Okay. In 1893, the Edison kinetoscope was introduced to the public. Now, this was an early form of motion picture, but instead of projecting the images on a screen, you looked through the viewer of a cabinet and you saw a brief, maybe 2 or 3 minute film starring such subjects as Eugene Sandow, the famous strongman. Now, Americans could not get enough of this new technology. And in 1894, the first kinetoscope parlor opened in New York City with 10 machines showing 10 films for 50 cents. Now, in 1894, 50 cents was a good chunk of change. It would buy you a nice restaurant lunch or a ticket to a Broadway show. But at Gimbel's in 1895, you could see 5 kinetoscopes for free. I mean, imagine going into a department store today and seeing Avatar: The Way of Water in all of its 3D Hollywood glory for free. In 1909, Gimbel's launched an aviation week with 7 airplanes on display. 2 years later, it sponsored a $5,000 air race between Governor's Island in New York and Belmont Plateau in Philadelphia. As part of the race, the 3 aviators had to circle over the new Gimbel store at Herald Square in Manhattan, as well as the Philadelphia store. Rounding out the Big Five were Litt Brothers, a great store in a great city, and Snellenberg's, the thrifty store for thrifty people. In 1890, Rachel Litt Waddell opened a millinery shop which flourished thanks to her promise to trim hats free of charge. In other words, you buy the hat and Rachel will provide the feathers and the ribbons and the wax cherries for free. She was so successful that in 1893, she was joined by her brothers Samuel and Jacob Litt, who built a new store at the corner of 8th and Market. Over the next decade, Litt Brothers, which really should have been called Litt Sister and Brothers, expanded along Market Street from 8th to 7th. And even today, you can still see the signs over the building's doors that promise to trim hats free of charge. Nathan Snellenberg, a German immigrant, founded a small clothing store on South Street in 1869. By 1882, he had expanded to this larger building at the intersection of 5th, South Street, and Passyunk Avenue. Snellenberg specialized in well-made men's and boys' clothing manufactured in its own factories to keep costs down. Snellenberg's great Philadelphia-made clothing was so popular with the immigrant community around South Street that he was able to make the move to Market Street. Snellenbergs took over these buildings on the south side of Market between 11th and 12th. To celebrate his store's big move, Nathan Snellenberg came up with a brilliant promotion to appeal to all segments of Philadelphia society. In February 1900, Snellenbergs announced a popularity contest for local clergy of all faiths. The 18 clerics who received the most votes from their congregation would be treated to a free trip to Europe. Now, in 1900, only wealthy Americans could really travel abroad, and then as now, most clergymen were anything but wealthy. Once in Europe, the winning clergy and their wives would spend 6 weeks touring the continent with all expenses paid. They would visit London and Oxford, go to Paris and see the 1900 Exposition, visit Cologne and Berlin, and end up at the Oberammergau Passion Play. By early July, over 100,000 ballots had been received at Snellenberg's. And if you study the list, you can see that it was a pretty eclectic group. There were at least 2 rabbis, 5 or 6 Catholic priests, and the rest were Protestant clergymen from different organizations. On July 14, 1900, the lucky clergymen and their wives set sail on the SS Belgenland. The happy party spent the next 6 weeks touring the continent, returning on October 9th. Now, no matter what Snellenbergs paid for the trip, you can bet that they more than made it back in terms of publicity, as well as thousands of new, loyal customers. In the 1920s, the rise of radio technology became another battleground for Philadelphia department stores. For many years, Gimbel's boasted that its radio station, WIP, was the first on the air in Philadelphia, launching on March 17, 1922. While across the street, WFI began broadcasting at Strawbridge and Clothier on the 18th. Litt Brothers launched their own radio station, WDAS, later that spring. In 1924, they renamed it WLIT, and then later it would merge with WFI to form the current radio station, WFIL. Wanamaker's launched its own station, WOO, in August 1922, with store founder John Wanamaker giving the inaugural address. Of the big 5 stores, only Snellenberg's passed on operating its own radio station. Of the 4 that did, Gimbel's got the biggest mileage out of being the radio store. When its new 15-story addition opened on Chestnut Street in 1927, the giant radio towers atop the building became a Center City landmark. Gimbel's also struck pay dirt with Uncle Whip, a mellow-voiced tenor named Christopher Graham, who told bedtime stories and sang songs every evening. By 1925, Graham was so popular that the mayor of Philadelphia appointed him honorary director of child welfare, and even gave him a city car with license plates reading Uncle Whip for visits to hospitals and schools. Even after Graham died in 1930, Uncle Whip would remain a popular figure on both TV and radio. As radio became a big business with huge technical demands, all 4 department stores disposed of their stations. But Gimbel's continued to experiment with new technology to promote its store. On October 27, 1945, the store initiated a closed-circuit television system with 20 locations throughout the store. Nearly 250,000 people viewed product demonstrations and short programs. For many Philadelphians, this was their first exposure to TV. Besides technological innovation, Gimbel's had a long tradition of philanthropy, dating back to the store's founding. In 1869, the Society of the United Hebrew Charities of Philadelphia, a forerunner of today's federations, was formed with Jacob Gimbel as its first president. In 1900, Gimbel saved Christmas for over 3,500 Philadelphia school teachers. Now, at that time, the city of Philadelphia decided rather than pay teachers at the beginning of the month of December, they would simply give them a voucher, an IOU. Remember, most teachers were female, women didn't have the vote, there were no unions, and this gave the city an easy way to balance its budget before the end of the fiscal year, while the teachers, of course, struggled to make ends meet during the month of December. Gimbel's allocated $250,000, this is 1900, remember, and offered to pay to cash out all of the teachers' vouchers for 100 cents on the dollar. And they didn't even require them to spend the money in the store. The mastermind behind this scheme was Philadelphia store president Ellis Gimbel, the youngest of the 7 sons of family patriarch Adam Gimbel. Ellis is really a fascinating character, and he deserves to be studied in greater detail. He was really outstanding as a businessman, a philanthropist, and a civic leader, even when compared to other department store owners who were really outstanding in these fields. As the director of Association for the Jewish Children of Philadelphia, Gimbel assisted the blind, underprivileged children, and other in-need groups. For many years, he sponsored Orphans' Day at the circus, and by 1946, more than 250,000 handicapped and underprivileged children had been his guests. In 1932, he created the Gimbel Award to recognize outstanding American women, beginning with aviator Amelia Earhart. Later recipients included Eleanor Roosevelt, Marian Anderson, and more recently, Sandra Day O'Connor. In 1920, though, Ellis Gimbel launched his most lasting contribution to American popular culture when he convinced 50 employees to give up their Thanksgiving morning, dress up as clowns, and hold a ragtag parade of 15 decorated cars. The first Thanksgiving Day parade attracted little attention, but it soon became a beloved part of the holiday season, especially after it added a fireman dressed as Santa Claus who capped the parade by climbing up a ladder to the toy department at Gimbel's. I gather that in 1924, some New York store, I forget the name, even stole the idea and began to hold their own parade. After World War II, the parade featured elaborate floats with popular characters from the movies, radio, and comic strips. In 1949, Dagwood, Blondie's omnivorous husband, hoisted a sandwich bigger than his head with a glazed ham on standby. Once television became a fixture in American homes, Gimbel's floats reflected the popularity of kiddie show characters. In 1950, Howdy Doody exploded out of a TV set to the delight of the peanut gallery sitting in front of City Hall. For many years, the Gimbel's parade was called Uncle Whip's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Here's Uncle Whip in 1952, looking like he's ready to shoot down a Chinese weather balloon in his bubble-shaped missile launcher. By this time, the parade consisted of thousands of marchers and dozens of floats. It was watched by 500,000 live spectators and by millions more on TV. Every other department store struggled to find the magic formula that would match Gimbel's Thanksgiving Day parade in terms of publicity and goodwill. In 1952, Lit Brothers held their own Thanksgiving Day parade, except they held theirs on November the 1st and promoted it by saying, well, this is Santa's first appearance in Philadelphia. Why wait until Thanksgiving when that Johnny-come-lately shows up at Gimbel's? But even with live reindeer, Bozo the Clown, and a mummers band, the parade didn't last beyond its first year. I mean, look at how thin those crowds are along the Parkway compared to the mobs around City Hall for the Gimbel's parade. In 1953, Santa arrived in style in a 1910 Hupmobile at Wanamaker's. But none of these substitute Santas really took hold. Every Philly kid knew that the real Santa climbed up a fire ladder to an upper floor at Gimbel's on Thanksgiving Day and would live there until Christmas Eve, asking children what gifts they wanted amid the splendors of Gimbel's Toyland. But other department stores kept trying to find the winning holiday season for the highly profitable Christmas season. This is when they made their biggest money. Little people were popular during the Great Depression. You had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and the Munchkins and the Wizard of Oz. So Lit Brothers brought in Mike and Ike, the famous boxing midgets, as a Christmas attraction. Because what says peace on earth, goodwill toward men, more than a couple of little people wailing on each other? Well, in 1956, Lit Brothers took advantage of the popular Disneyland theme park and TV show by setting up its own in-house Disneyland. And here, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy helped several visitors to Lit's launch a rocket ship in Tomorrowland. Well, finally, in 1962, Lit's hit the holiday jackpot with the Enchanted Colonial Christmas Village. 18 vignettes depicted Christmas in colonial Philadelphia with animated figures. Here, Miss Christmas 1966 cuts the ribbon opening the display with the president of Lit's and a little visitor. For many years, Wanamaker's focused on its forte, magnificently lavish store displays. In 1927, the Grand Court was so heavily decorated that you could barely find the sales counters. This is the Grand Court decorated for Christmas 1931. There may have been a depression going on outside, but you'd never know it inside Wanamaker's. Talk about a cathedral of commerce. Meanwhile, children could wander through the lavish displays on their way to visit Santa. Here we see Wanamaker's workmen constructing Candy Stick Lane in the toy department. And while children waited to see Santa, they could be entertained by the Candy Stick Boy Band featuring Tinkle Terry on the drums. After World War II, Wanamaker's holiday decorations became a little more modern. Starting in 1946, small baby boomers could zoom above the toy department on the 8th floor in this miniature red and silver monorail called the Rocket Express. In November 1955, Wanamaker's introduced its best-loved and most durable holiday tradition, the light show. Originally, the show consisted of a magic Christmas tree in changing colors and enchanted fountains that danced to music. Over the years, a number of lighted figures were added, including snowmen, teddy bears, ballerinas, all topped by Santa steering the Holiday Express. While organ concerts were the norm at Wanamaker's, choral music continued to be the forte at Strawbridge and Clothier. For many years, the employee chorus and orchestra gave holiday concerts both at the store and at other venues like the Academy of Music. And then in 1985, Strawbridge and Clothier introduced its own landmark Christmas attraction, the Dickens Village, a 26-scene interpretation of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. A huge success, the village attracted nearly 170,000 visitors during its first 6 weeks. Throughout the 20th century, department stores used their status as gathering places to promote social change as well as sell holiday goods. In autumn 1947, Gimbels asked Philadelphia to imagine how their grimy industrial city could transform itself in the post-war period. The Better Philadelphia exhibition was designed by city planner Edmund Bacon, along with architects Oscar Stonerov and Louis I. Kahn. The multimedia exhibition called attention to the need for urban renewal in Philadelphia, which at that point was very decrepit. At the beginning, a time-space machine used backlit panels to illustrate the city's growth from the 17th century to the present. The highlight of the exhibition was a huge 30 by 14-foot scale model of Center City as it then appeared. The vast model, complete with 45,000 individual buildings, 25,000 vehicles, and 12,000 trees, cost over $50,000. As the narrator discussed plans for urban renewal, sections of the model flipped over, revealing how Philadelphia might appear in 1980. The Chinese Wall, which carried trains between Broad Street Station and 30th Street, was replaced by an avenue of gleaming office buildings called Penn Center. A revitalized Society Hill appeared, along with the new mall surrounding Independence Hall. Although many of these plans would become reality over the coming decades, in 1947 they were still pipe dreams. On the way out, visitors were greeted by a sign that asked, "What kind of Philadelphia are you going to give your children?" In only 5 weeks, nearly 400,000 visitors viewed the Better Philadelphia exhibition, helping to generate the enthusiasm needed to reinvent the city over the coming years. But while visitors to Gimbels were pondering the future of Center City, Gimbels and other stores were following their customers out to the suburbs. Strawbridge and Clothier had opened suburban branches in Ardmore and Jenkintown in 1930. This photo shows the Jenkintown store on a still semi-rural Old York Road in around 1935. But after these two stores, the Depression and the World War II prevented any further development. But all that changed with the post-war suburban surge. Between 1950 and 1980, the Big Five stores opened over 40 branches outside Center City. In February 1952, TV show host Ed Sullivan visited Strawbridge and Clothier's Jenkintown store to accept an award. Now, before World War II, it would have been unthinkable to have a big celebrity appear anywhere but at the Center City flagship. But by 1952, the suburbs were where the action was. Soon, other department stores were opening suburban branches or becoming anchor stores at the new malls that were popping up around Philadelphia. In 1957, Gimbels opened a store at 69th Street in Upper Darby. Since this was the chain's third store, many triplets were invited to opening day ceremonies. Here, many of them watched TV personality Steve Allen, popular host of The Tonight Show, hoist the American flag outside the new store. While suburban branches blossomed, sales were withering in Center City. In April 1954, Snellenberg's unveiled plans for a $4.5 million redesign of its Victorian flagship. These plans were never realized. It also launched new promotions like a Mother's Day flower show. But none of this prevented Snellenberg's from closing its doors in Center City in 1963, while its suburban stores were absorbed by Litt Brothers. By this time, both Litt's and Gimbels were also considering closing their Center City stores. In response, the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority drew up plans for a $750 million renewal of Market Street East. Its centerpiece would be the gallery and multi-level mall shown here in a 1969 architect's design. After a long gestation, the gallery would finally open its doors in 1977, anchored by Strawbridge and Clothier at its east and a new Gimbel store at its west. Meanwhile, the empty original Gimbel's building on the other side of Market Street was demolished in 1980. During this period, Americans were traveling abroad more often, and they became fascinated by foreign cultures. Many department stores had international fairs and displays. In 1966, Strawbridge and Clothier sponsored an Italia Bravissima fair. After the fair ended, a reproduction of Il Porcellino, a bronze board that once guarded the Mercato Nuovo in Florence in 1612, became a permanent resident of the store. As with the original, rubbing the snout of Il Porcellino was supposed to bring customers good luck. Sadly, all the rubbing in the world couldn't stave off the decline of Philadelphia department stores. Victim of suburban blight, changing retail and socioeconomic patterns, and massive industry consolidation. After Snellenberg's vanished in 1963, the rest of the Big Five stores also disappeared one by one. Litz in 1977, Gimbel's in 1986, Wanamaker's in 1995, and Strawbridge's in 2006. During the same period, many of the upscale boutiques that once graced Chestnut and Walnut Streets also closed. Today, Il Porcellino's neighbors are reporters for the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, who moved into the vacated Strawbridge and Clothier building in 2011. And our friend Il Porcellino stands guard over a new giant heirloom market. Meanwhile, Philadelphia's former retail center is struggling to reinvent itself. At the southwest corner of 8th and Market, a parking lot has occupied the former site of the original Gimbel store since 1980, defying all attempts to redevelop it as everything from a Disney superstore to a casino. The historic Litt Brothers building almost suffered the same fate as the Gimbel's building after the store closed in 1977, until a grassroots preservation movement saved it from demolition. Now on the National Register of Historic Places, the Mellon Independence Center houses offices, restaurants, and retail space. A couple of years ago, it looked like all of Market Street East was on its way to a rebirth. Real estate analysts in 2017 proclaimed the corridor as the most desirable retail corridor in America, with nearly 1 million square feet of new or renovated retail space to be completed by 2020. The old gallery was being reborn as Fashion District Philadelphia, a $325 million project featuring designer outlets, restaurants, and a full-size movie theater. A few blocks west on Market, the remains of the former Snellenberg store, which was reduced from 6 stories to 2 in the 1960s, are being replaced by a new 1 million square foot complex called East Market, which combines retail and restaurant space with a residential, hotel, and office tower. Sadly, COVID changed the picture for many of these hopeful developments, as it has with so many activities. Few business sectors have been hit as hard by the epidemic as bricks and mortar retail. By the end of 2020, roughly 50% of the businesses that once occupied Philadelphia's current pre-mill retail district, the area around Rittenhouse Square, had been shuttered. In December 2020, the Pennsylvania Real Estate Investment Trust, owner of Fashion District Philadelphia, filed for bankruptcy, ceding control of the district complex to another real estate developer. Meanwhile, Century 21, one of the mall's largest tenants, also filed for bankruptcy in 2020 and closed all its stores. In 2021, the Washington Post reported that nearly 200 department stores had been shuttered in the past year. Another 800, representing roughly half the country's remaining mall-based locations, are expected to fold within the next 5 years. And in an eerie twist of fate, many empty mall stores were reborn as COVID testing or vaccination centers, like this former Lord & Taylor at the Moorestown Mall in New Jersey. Now, recently, there have been a few glimmers of hope amidst all the gloom. Last year, it was reported that downtown foot traffic in Center City had increased since 2020, as had new retail investment and construction. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Center City has welcomed 132 new storefront retailers, including these two on Walnut Street. Well, despite this avalanche of change, traces of Philadelphia's golden age of retail continue to linger on. Much of this is due to Macy's, which continues to hold court in the historic Wanamaker's building, as it has since 2006. And by the way, the store never really closed. After Wanamaker's, it was reborn first as a Hex, and then as a Lord & Taylor, and then I think for a brief period it may even have been a Strawbridge's, before finally becoming a Macy's in 2006. Now, Macy's is experiencing its own financial difficulties, and it was even before COVID hit. Over the past couple of years, it's closed a number of local stores and laid off hundreds of employees in the Philadelphia region. But so far, the Center City store has escaped, knock wood, the chopping block. And in the meantime, Macy's Philadelphia has remained committed to preserving some of the old Wanamaker store's most beloved institutions. In 1991, the Friends of the Wanamaker organ was founded to restore the magnificent instrument, which had fallen into disrepair. Sadly, all of those dancing fountains really found their way into the, wiring and the machinery of the organ. Once the former Wanamaker's was rebranded as Macy's in 2006, corporate management began to support the Friends in their campaign. And today, the historic organ, valued at roughly $75 million, is completely restored and is a National Historic Landmark. Macy's and the Friends of the Wanamaker organ have co-sponsored several joint concerts with the Philadelphia Orchestra and other groups. And of course, if you visit the store, you can hear the organ twice a day, 6 days a week, at 12 noon and 5:30 p.m. Macy's has also continued to sponsor that perennial favorite, the Holiday Light Show. Traditionally opening on the day after Thanksgiving, it features a magic Christmas tree with over 100,000 LED lights in constantly changing colors. The light show continues to enchant Philadelphians of all ages, even if some of us still haven't quite gotten used to John Facenda's growling narration being replaced by Julie Andrews' mellifluous tones. After a hiatus in 2020 because of COVID, the light show was back again in 2021, as was the Dickens Village, which Macy's adopted from the former Strawbridge and Clothier in 2006. Traces of Philadelphia's golden age of retail can be seen in other locations, such as the Please Touch Museum in Memorial Hall in West Fairmount Park. There, visitors will discover the Rocket Express monorail. Although now stationary, the Rocket Express still fascinates small Philadelphians as much as it did when it glided high above the toy department at Wanamaker's. Other beloved holiday traditions have also adapted to change. The oldest Thanksgiving Day parade in the country recently celebrated its centenary, although it now takes place on the Parkway instead of around City Hall. And instead of climbing up a stepladder to Gimbel's Toyland, Santa Claus, now joined by Mrs. Claus, does a rocky sprint up the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. After the parade's corporate sponsorship passed from Gimbel's to stores like Boscov's and IKEA, it is now sponsored by Dunkin' Donuts, in a telling sign of how the retail scene has changed in Philadelphia. Other traces of Philadelphia's golden age of retail exist in a less tangible form. The LSA Gimbel Charitable Trust one of a number of trusts established by various branches of the Gimbel family, continues its mission of entertaining and inspiring experiences for children in largely underserved communities. Recently, it joined forces with the First Tee to sponsor a program where visually impaired and underprivileged children can try their hand at golf. And in an echo of past circus days, in 2021, the Gimbel Trust partnered with Temple University and the Philadelphia Housing Authority to sponsor the Swing into School Circus. This gives North Philadelphia children a chance to experience the fun of the circus with games, activities, food, prizes, and school supply giveaways. So I guess it can't be all peanuts and popcorn. So while a lot has changed over the years, it's nice to see that a few things still remain and have stayed the same. And on that note, I'd like to thank you and open the floor for any questions.
Okay, we're going to take questions. If you will raise your hand, Linda, or I will call on you. Linda? Linda, you have to unmute.
I can't see everybody on my screen.
Tom, can you unshare?
Oh, certainly. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or mechanically or just a physical, and Linda or I will call on you.
Or you can put it in the chat and we'll read it.
Yeah, you can, or you put. Anybody have a question for Tom?
I guess I do.
All right, Lynn.
Okay. I was just going to ask, Tom, you did a wonderful job, by the way.
Thank you.
And I was just going to ask you about some of the like Horn and Hard Arts and Linton's and all the old restaurants. Like what happened there?
Well, I think I can't really speak to Linton's very much, but not too long ago, I saw a wonderful documentary on the Automat, the Horn and Hard Arts. I think it's on Netflix, and it's wonderful. It has Colin Powell, and it has Mayor Good, and you know, Mel Brooks, and all these great figures talking about their Horn and Hard Art experience. And part of the problem was that you had the change in Center City because most automats were open 24 hours a day. They became refuges for the homeless. There was a perception they weren't safe, but they were also done in by the inflation of the 1970s. When food became very expensive, then you really couldn't have the same thing where people could get change and pop 50 cents into a slot and, you know, pull out one of their wonderful cream spinach or baked beans. And at any rate, the company, you know, tried going to the sit-down restaurant route, but that didn't really work. And finally, they just started closing down. And I think the last Automat, which was located in Manhattan, closed in the 1980s. And I'm going to assume that the same thing happened to Linton's. Also, you had fast food coming in. And you didn't go to the Automat. That's where our parents ate. You wanted to go get a Whopper at Burger King, where all the cool kids were hanging out. So I think that's what happened with those restaurants.
Well, they were the best memories of my life.
It was called The Automat, and it was on Netflix.
Right.
It was a documentary.
Don,
Wonderful documentary.
Don, do you have a question?
I do. So hearing your talk was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's amazing the amount of business that the department stores must have done to be able to be so philanthropic. So my question to you is, how did the customers get there? Do you know, did they drive? Did they take the subway? There must have been a great deal of coming and going in that area. And I'm wondering, just thinking out loud, I guess the subways were built.
If I could speak to that, in 1908, when the city's first subway line opened, Market Street, it basically ran from Upper Darby to down Market Street to the Delaware River. And there were stops at 13th Street for Wanamaker's, at 11th Street for Snellenberg's, and at 8th Street for the other three stores. And you could all of the stores opened basement shops, and you could just walk out of the subway, walk a few streets, and you were in the store. And at first, they were very elegant. There are these picture postcards from like 1910 showing the subway with this beautiful boutique mannequins wearing these elegant gowns. And then as the subways became more proletarian, then it was like, okay, this is where you have your bargain basement. This is where you have the quick, cheap restaurant as opposed to the tea room or something like that. So you had subways, you had trolleys, you know, of course you had Suburban Station, which was not too far. One of the big projects involved in the Market Street East redesign was the creation of the tunnel, which basically connected Suburban Station with I'm blanking out. I'm having a senior moment with the other down, with the Reading Terminal Station. So the city was set. These stores gravitated to what was already a major area of transit where the population gathered, but they used their clout to make sure that if a subway was built or if trolley lines were put in place, that they were going to bring people to them.
So were they also meccas of shopping because the suburbs were not built up that much and there was not a lot of suburban competition?
Exactly. You did not see that until after World War II, when, as I mentioned, you had the stores opening suburban branches, and then you also had malls with two, and you always had two anchor stores, and one of them was slightly more upscale than the other. So you might have a Wanamaker's and a Snellenberg's, or you would have a Lord & Taylor and a Sears, you know, but you wanted to have as broad a range as possible. When King of Prussia was first built back in the 50s, it had 3 department stores. And, you know, it continued to expand. I think at its height, it had something like 6 different department stores in its combined complex. But yeah, up until World War II, Center City was where the action was.
Interesting.
Anybody else?
It was funny, before, you know, we began, people were sharing all of their memories about going downtown for the stores, for like having their special day, you know, getting dressed up and going shopping and then eating at the Crystal Tea Room or the Corinthian Room or something. And, you know, then maybe you would go see a movie somewhere on, you know, West Market Street.
You know, Tom, I forgot to mention, when I used to go down, I saw when I was 12 to work at my father's jewelry store at 8th and Sansom, I used to take a bus like my older brother called the Shoppers Special. Oh. Just hit me. That was the bus we took. Oh my God, the Shoppers Special.
Yeah.
I remember going with my mother. It was like a big deal. And you did get, I mean, it was, to go with my mother into town was like, you know, that was a memory. It was, we went, it was special to go with my mother into town. And it was, my sister was younger. She wasn't allowed to go. I went because I was older, and my sister had to stay with my grandmother. So it was special for me because I was older and I was allowed to go. And I remember there was a place that you got soft ice cream near Gimbel's, I think, or one of them near, like you said, on the subway. And that was special. And it was a big deal. And my mother and I ate, I don't remember, in Gimbel's or somewhere, but it was special. We got dressed up, and that was, I think I got it for getting, in first grade, I got these little cards. And if you got so many little cards with a sticker on it, that was my reward, because I got so many little stickers for being good in first grade. And that was my reward, to go into Center City with my mother.
I see that.
Marge?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I grew up in Willow Grove, and Pennsylvania, and I remember the suburban Snellenbergs. And I thought you mentioned that their plans were unrealized to open in the suburbs, because I do remember Snellenbergs in downtown Willow Grove.
Yeah, they did have suburban stores. Now, their plans were to like take their Victorian Center City store, which it sort of looks a little bit like a fortress from Game of Thrones. And they were going to like make it look like one of the new suburban stores. They were going to like put a clean 50s facade over it. And basically the store closed before they could do any of that. Snellenbergs had been bought by Albert Greenfield, who also owned Litz. He sort of had this city stores. And he realized that by the 1950s, 1960s, that the two stores were cannibalizing each other. They were going after the same market, and that they really he couldn't afford to keep both stores running. So Snellenbergs was sort of at the bottom of the food chain. So they were the first to go. And all of their suburban stores became Litz stores at that point.
Randy, did you have a question?
Yeah. Two things. One, Tom, is your book available like on Amazon? Could I get it there?
Yes, you can. He said, holding up his handy copy that he just happens.
Okay.
It is available on Amazon, and you can get it there.
Okay.
Your local library may also have it. As much as I hate to say it, you should support your local library, but you can get the book on Amazon.
Okay. Because the other thing I was thinking is my uncle was a buyer of a women's lingerie for Lip Brothers for over 25 years. In fact, when I was 12 years old, so I was just doing my math, I guess it was 1965, he carried this one line of garments that were more, you could walk out of your house with them. They were granny dresses and stuff.
And
he hired me to be a model on the ground floor there, the first floor. And that was like, I was so proud. And my mother let me take the L down by myself. I was 12 years old, downtown, and met my uncle. And sadly, the store went overnight. He went in on a whatever day, and the next day the store was closed. And I believe that was 1989. They shuttered Lip Brothers.
I think it was 1979 because
1979?
Well, I'm sorry.
I think it was because I remember where we were living, and he lived around the corner from us.
It was right around then because the chairman
89, right? 19.
No, 79. The chairman of Lip Brothers left and came to Gimbel's at that time, Stanley Abelson. And I worked for him, so I know that.
Okay. I thought it was 89. Okay.
And also by 1980, they had started the campaign to preserve the vacant Litz building.
Oh, okay.
Was under threat of demolition at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Bill Lloyd
Yes.
has that.
Thank you, Tom. It was really a great presentation.
Thank you.
Having lived through most of it, I could say you're very accurate.
Good, thank you.
Just a couple of comments that of interest. When I joined Gimbel's in the executive training program in '71, the two things we were told right away was we'd be making a contribution each year to Allied Jewish Appeal, now Federation, and then we would be involved in the Gimbel Day Parade. Those were two major things aside from doing your job there that they wanted. And I started out as a little street marshal standing on a corner, waving. And in the early 80s, because I had gone to New York and it was tough at that point to stay involved, but I was one of the two directors of the parade at that point. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, the other gentleman, there was a director, a good friend of mine, just passed away recently. He was older than me. And his daughter is now the person whose marketing company runs the parade each year.
Yeah.
Now, Bill, can I ask you a question about the Gimbals Day Parade? Somebody once asked me why the Macy's parade in New York has all of those great balloons. And in Philadelphia, we never really had balloons. We had floats. And somebody suggested that it was because there were so many trolley lines overhead in Center City at the time that having balloons wasn't really an option. Do you know anything about why Philly never had balloons?
My understanding was more of a housing issue in terms of preparation. And because we did have an occasional balloon, but so I don't think it was too much of the wires. It was tough enough with the floats. And then they had to be lined up along the art museum for about a mile, all put in order, bands in one spot, things everywhere else. I was the person that did the merging with my chart, so if they went in the wrong order, they would blame me. That was pretty much that story. And the other thing is, you mentioned about the demolition of Gimbals. The nice thing was at that point, it was because we had moved across the street to Market East.
Right.
We still, I don't know, it's not thriving, but doing, pretty good business still at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one thing you notice about all of the buildings is that with the exception of the Wanamaker's building, which was completely redone in 1911, that if you look at the other buildings, they're sort of a collection of structures that these stores became so popular and they grew so quickly that they were always gobbling up the neighboring buildings and adding on to them so they could continue to expand their sales and their merchandise.
Uninterrupted.
Yep.
I just want to add one other thing, which I really didn't touch on in the talk, and then we probably want to wrap things up. But one thing I didn't talk about, which I do want to point out, was how revolutionary all of the major department stores are in terms of offering benefits and special programs to their employees. These department stores, they were large. The founders were very much patriarchs, but they realized that they were not paying the same salaries as you might be able to get in manufacturing or in finance or something. So they offered all of these programs to make sure that their employees could live a good middle-class life. Everything from continuing education to college scholarships for kids, mortgage loan programs, profit sharing, et cetera, to make sure that their employees could lead a really good life. And they were among the pioneers. Health insurance. Most companies didn't offer health insurance up until World War II, and department stores usually offered some sort of a medical plan to make sure that their employees were healthy. They realized how valuable keeping an experienced staff was, and they did everything in their power to maintain them.
Mm. That's interesting.
Do we have any more questions?
Well, I was just going to make a comment. My dad, so I hear the story, I wasn't born yet, but my dad came out of the Army, and his first little property that he owned as a luncheonette owner in the food business was out the back of Litt Brothers on Filbert Street. And the way I have a picture of it here, but the way I was told, it was a 3-walled hut. And people came up to the front wall where it was just a little open air serving area that people could order their food. And he had just enough room to, my mother used to say, literally turn around. If he turned around too fast, he'd end up being frying himself on the grill. But Albert M. Greenfield was his so-called boss because he owned the property where this luncheonette stood. And he eventually put him out of business. He told him one day, you know, we're really sorry, we need the property and you're out of here, and gave him no warning whatsoever. But my dad made a comfortable living for many years out of that little 3-walled hut, so to speak. And, you know, I have a picture of it to prove it. And then he moved on further up north to the Olney area of Philadelphia. But my dad was a go-getter, and he always used to talk when we were young kids about, you know, his days out the back of Lit Brothers. So
thanks, Marlene.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It was wonderful, and it brings back wonderful memories, I'm sure, for most of us that are here. So thanks for coming, and thanks for you know, telling us everything that happened. And it was a great evening, and thank you all for coming and